Puella Magi Madoka Magica. When I say this name, what image pops into your head? Most definitely the original 12-episode anime, maybe the Rebellion story film, and potentially even the tie-in games Magia Record and Magia etc. For the average viewer of the series, this is where it might end. But, dear viewers, I urge you to poke around just a little more, as right below the surface is an incredibly vast world of stories that has depth sometimes rivaling the original series. Of course, I'm talking about the world of Madoka Magica manga. Aside from the first adaptation of the anime, there is a plethora of varied manga side stories focusing on different parts of the franchise and its characters. Most recently, Magia Exodra players were introduced to Tart. No, I am not going to call her dark. Tart from the aptly named Tart Magica manga, a story about the Madoka Magica world's version of Jeanne d'Arc. But as you saw in the title, I'm going to be zeroing in on one story in particular, and talking about probably the most important of these side story manga, The Different Story. Puella Magi Madoka Magica The Different Story is both a prequel and divergent story that focuses on the two most arguably underused characters from the original anime, being Mami Tomoe and Kyoko Sakura. It's important to note that this is not a wholly original work by the manga's author and illustrator Hanokage, but is actually partly inspired by the original script from the third Madoka Magica drama CD titled Farewell Story. Farewell Story was written by Hiramatsu Masaki, who also created the script for the first drama CD titled Memories of You. The Different Story adapts the events mentioned in that drama CD almost entirely for the first of its 3-volume narrative, before diverging into its own story from the second volume onwards. Now listen carefully, guys, this is important. Due to this being a purchasable product, I do not intend to do anything that might be interpreted as redistributing the book illegally. For that reason, when I discuss moments from the book, I will use either stills from the anime that are most appropriate, or I may show censored or edited scans of the book where it is most needed. I highly encourage you to go out and purchase the book officially and support the creators. This video exists solely for discussion and review purposes only. I will also add on this disclaimer. Please do not, under any circumstances, try to ask questions of Hiramatsu-san or Hanokage. Yes, they have public social media accounts, but they are not representatives of the brand and cannot answer anything on behalf of the studio unless permitted. Please keep speculation about the works to our community and do not place the creators in any uncomfortable situations. I'm Luca Magica, and today we're not covering a theory or analyzing a new trailer. We're going to be covering what I believe to be close to the best story that Puella Magi Madoka Magica has to offer. A full look at this work has been long overdue on YouTube, and as a self-proclaimed New Age Madoka tuber, I'm taking it upon myself to light that spark and shed some light on parts of the franchise that might remain obscure to fans both new and old. Take your time with the video. It's a very long script, so make sure to pause if you need breaks. If you like my coverage and my videos, then feel free to like this video and subscribe for more. Check out my Madoka Magica playlist on my channel for other related videos. Now, if you're ready to start this deep dive, then sit back, relax, grab a snack, grab a drink, and enjoy. Chapter 1 immediately sees us thrust right back into the world of Mitakihara City in the most appropriate way possible. A witch is on the loose. From the first page, we already see Mami and two unknown magical girls teaming up to fight this monstrous bug-like beast. In this first showing alone, we can already pick up on some nuance in what's going on here. The two unknowns are practically side by side and both have bladed weapons. In the silhouette, it appears that one has a rapier while the other has a scythe. Mami is positioned slightly away from the pair and of course is using her iconic musket to fight. Now you may be asking me why I'm even bringing this up, and that's a fair question, theoretical viewer. But think about what we know of this series. Think of specifically the first episode when Madoka and Sayaka fall into that labyrinth. They are together, clinging to each other tightly as Mami steps in and protects them. In that context, we are to assume it's just because of Mami's status as a magical girl and them as humans at the time, so she would naturally be far away from them. So then, why is Mami positioned away from these magical girls if they're all on the same playing field? One pretty obvious observation is that their bladed weapons means they will naturally be close to the creature when fighting, while Mami's musket is better used from a distance. But Mami doesn't need to use muskets. She could have her magic create whatever she'd like. She chooses to make her main weapon a gun. She chooses a ranged style of fighting. A ranged weapon being Mami's choice to fight with implies a deliberate effort to put distance between herself and others. This small nuance is important here to keep in mind going forward, and I can assure you it is certainly a very deliberate choice to frame the first page this way. And yes, we are indeed still only on that first page, so strap in, folks. The fight against this witch goes on for the next 2 pages, but once it begins to overwhelm the pair of blade wielders who appear to be sisters, they decide it's too much for them and flee. We learn here that Mami only just stepped in to help them. They don't even know her name yet. They call out to her, just calling her Magical Girl, and announce their intent to back off from the fight, urging that Mami does the same. Mami is completely taken aback by this. She watches as the girls leave to fight her alone, but the witch's approach means she can't even take a moment to pause and think about what just happened. While deflecting the approach of the witch, with her ribbon, Mami psychs herself up and tells us point blank exactly what her mission statement is as a magical girl. In order to protect the people of this city, I mustn't flee this battle. She draws more muskets out and finishes the witch off then and there with an overwhelming display of strength. The labyrinth disappears shortly after, and Mami transforms back into her civilian attire as the witch's grief seed lands nearby. Almost instantly, Mami is praised for her strength and thanked for her assistance by the pair who retreated, both amazed in their own differing ways by Mami's ability to fight the witch so effectively. They apologize for leaving Mami on her own, stating simply that they just did not want to die. Overhearing a comment from them about using up too much magic for nothing in return, Mami tries to gift the dropped grief seed to the strangers so that they can purify their soul gems. As should be an attitude familiar to anybody who's seen the original show, the girls knock back the help, their amazement of Mami's skill turning to confusion about her gesture, even going so far as to ask if she's a newbie to the witch hunting scene. They are pretty upfront about the whole thing. They're not doing the whole magical girl thing for a noble reason, and they didn't even earn the grief seed. Their mentality appears to be fairly common to what we see in the main series, at least when we first meet Kyoko and Homura. They consider other magical girls to be rivals and don't believe in sharing rewards, even if they all fought together. Another point of interest to bring up is that one of the unknown girls says something to the effect of, being that nice to everyone will only result in you being used up one day. Homura famously recites a similar message to Madoka, but for her there, it's more of a warning to not put herself in a state where tragedy will take advantage of her kindness. Another example in a similar but more harsh vein is that of Kyoko's live for the self mentality that she imparts on Sayaka. I just think it's interesting that magical girls who have been at this for a while just grow to adopt that kind of mindset, and it's reinforced here during this story's prologue, likely because of where this story will eventually leave our main heroines. Mami watches as they leave and tries her best to tell them to take care of themselves, but her words seem to fall on deaf ears as they discuss their hunting strategy amongst themselves, and it's a mindset we know from the show, specifically from Kyoko. The idea is simple and practical. Familiars don't drop grief seeds, but witches do. Familiars grow into witches, so it's better to let them incubate and form into witches so that a magical girl can later harvest more grief seeds. In the show, this forms a schism between Kyoko and Sayaka, the latter of whom adopted the hero complex mindset from Mami. In this prologue, Mami does not say a word, and to be honest, it's because she doesn't have to. With knowledge from the show, we already know exactly where her beliefs lie. And with Mami left to watch in disappointment as those two girls leave, we end our prologue on a quiet note. At this point, we don't know if these girls are going to show up again, we don't know who they are, and we have no idea what their less than noble motivations are in the slightest. But I think that's the point, because Mami doesn't know either. Mami doesn't care who it is. If someone is in need of help, she will provide it. there's a chance she'll never know who the people she saves are beyond being victims of people just down on their luck. We get a sense of this being the norm for her in the original show. Think of the second episode. The office lady, whose depression and exhaustion is multiplied by Gertrude's witch's kiss, is a fantastic example to showcase this. Mommy is a traditional heroine. If you watched my Sword Art Online Episode 7 review, which you totally should by the way, it's great, then you'll know I have a favorite comparison to do called the pro versus reactive hero scale. TLDR. Superman is a proactive hero. He goes about and looks for people to help whether or not some bad thing is happening, while Goku is a reactive hero, still helpful but mostly performs his heroics when something immediately threatens the planet. Mami is a lot like Superman in that she is proactive. She goes out of her way to fight familiars and not just witches, and she helps anyone who needs it. She assists magical girls with no question, even if she might not know their names or motivations. Even if her bravery is a front, the fact that her front is that of a proactive hero is something we shouldn't just brush off. She has the instinct to do good, facade or not. She isn't pretending to be good, she only pretends to have the confidence to back that up and forces herself to do so. What's so interesting about this prologue, which we'll also see in the actual start of the chapter, is that it might only be a few months or so into Mami's career as a magical girl, which, if that is true, it means she has adopted that mindset about needing to present herself so confidently fairly early on. I like this implication, to be honest, because it really shows us that Mami isn't simply hard-headed and different for the sake of it. It's like a lifeline for her to be like this. Her continuing to hold to this idea of presenting as generous and heroic as possible, even years into her work, just adds a lot more to her and shows how much this identity means to her. Her mindset essentially hardened into a belief that if she gives up on who Mami Tomoe has become, she may as well be dead. It's just fascinating to imagine how early this formed. In any case, let's actually see where this story begins. The chapter opens about a year after the prologue, smack bang in the middle of Mitakihara Middle School at the end of a school day. I think this time jump is meant to accomplish two distinct things. First, it shows us just how stagnant the world of magic actually is. Immediately, Mami's mood is clearly established from just the third panel of this page, and it's just like she was at the end of the last one, which of course acts as visual shorthand to convey a lack of change. Secondly, it even further separates Mami from her old life if you think about this from the perspective of time, which is very important to the franchise. The more time marches forward, given the type of person Mami is, we should see her become less like the person she used to be. Of course, we are only guessing what Mami was like before being a magical girl, but at the very least, given what we know about her from the main series, we should expect to see her double down on that behavior and quickly. And what happens here? We are introduced to a version of Mami fairly close to what we'd come to see in the main series. You guys remember that sad scene in the third episode, right? Yeah, no, not that one. The one where Mami lists the cons of being a magical girl to Madoka. Among other things, she says that Madoka won't have time for friends or boyfriends if she makes a contract with Kyubey. In this chapter, when the story properly starts, we see Mami adopting this mindset, and I really do word it as mindset deliberately. In the prologue, we are introduced to two magical girls who are either friends or sisters. Sure, it's not exactly classmates and boyfriends, but I think that Mami isn't entirely accurate in her assessment that a magical girl would have no time for these things. I think the reason she adopts and then later teaches this mindset is simply because most of her life is tainted by loss. I truly believe that magical girls could spend time with other people if they really wanted to. I would have literally no other chance to bring this up otherwise, but a great example of this comes from probably my favorite character in Magia Record. Natsuki Utsuho is a girl whose wish was to cure her brother's illness so he wouldn't miss out on playing an important game of baseball with his team. Natsuki is a cheerleader for this same team, and her story reveals that her motivation as a magical girl comes from a deeply ingrained desire to remain by the side of her friends and family. As a magical girl, it appears Natsuki has the ability to empower others by cheering them on. Amazingly, Natsuki is the manager of her brother's baseball team and the cheerleading club at school, and is still, as a magical girl, friends with its other members, proving point blank that yes, a magical girl can absolutely maintain a good social life if she so chooses. Most magical girls assume they can't live that way for what I believe is the same reason that drives Mami's teachings. They initially come from a place of lust that they come to think is natural because of how young they were when it happened to them. In any case, what we see is Mami being invited to go to the mall after school by her classmates, but she declines due to being busy. One of the other students remarks how hard it is for Mami since she lives alone, and this is something I want to take a closer look at. So the entire thesis statement of Mami's character can be summed up as, quote, "It's okay to need help," unquote. Ironically, this ends up being Sayaka's too, albeit to a much more extreme degree, but I digress. The point is, Mommy is a character who deliberately isolates herself, and it eventually manifests into something she doesn't recognize as a deliberate action on her end, and more something that becomes natural. The student saying that it must be hard living alone is not incorrect in their assessment of Mommy's living arrangements, but I think Mommy conflates that with her life as a magical girl too. Obviously, Mommy wants connection, which we will soon see more of, but Mommy is also a wonderful paradox. I feel she's not quite a character who fits the hedgehog style Emma assessment in psychology perfectly, but it's clear she struggles with the idea of true connection, so if an easy answer as to why she's alone pops up, she's going to take it. Moving on, we learn on the next page that Mommy is not fully isolationist, as those same classmates reminisce about visiting her house for cake. Of course, the problem with a connection like that is the same problem with cake itself. It's temporary. You can only savor the taste of cake for so long, but eventually you'll have eaten it all and be left with just the crumbs. And a friendship like this, which is only transactional, is much the same. Sure, you can enjoy the little moments where the other person comes by, but if it's for something as innocuous as free food, no matter how nice those moments are, it's going to inevitably be fleeting. At least, that's how Mommy sees it. We don't know if these friends are only going to visit for Mommy's cake. I mean, yeah, they might be, but they just as easily could be going because they genuinely like Mommy. Whether they are or not isn't the point. The point is that Mommy thinks so. We'll put a pin in this observation because it's going to be relevant more towards the end of this chapter, but keep this idea in mind. Mommy preemptively assumes friendship is temporary and transactional. Now let's continue with the actual chapter. Of course, Mommy turns down her friend's invitation because she patrols Mitaki Harbor City every afternoon and into the night, scouring the area for witch activity. But again, this is not a strict schedule she has to follow, it's an imposed one. It's especially sad to realize how much of Mommy's mannerisms are forced as a result of her past when you recall that, again, this is a prequel set probably a year or so before the original anime's timeline, which means she has been doing this forced routine for basically nobody but herself for the past year and a half, let's say at minimum, when we see her in the anime, for basically no benefit other than staying alive. In any case, Mommy continues patrolling on this particular night too, and picks up the trace of a witch to follow. When she arrives at the particular barrier she trekked, though, she quickly discovers that someone else is already inside in the middle of a battle, and it's here that the other protagonist of this tale, Kyoko Sakura, finally makes her debut. Her first line of dialogue remarks about how she is used to this enemy being so strong, and while we don't know with 100% certainty yet, there's an implication that she has fought this particular witch before and is now re-engaging it. The other thing that we can take notice of here is that there are two Kyokos? Yep, your eyes aren't playing tricks on you. First seen in Madoka Magica Portable, Kyoko actually has magic aside from the latticework barrier seen in the original show and Rebellion. It's a spell called Rosso Phantasma, and it allows her to make illusory copies of herself. Now, as a viewer of the original show, one might be asking why she doesn't do it in the fight with Octavia, or any other fight in the original show, or even the Rebellion story for that matter. Good. Keep that question in the back of your mind. Kyoko tricks the witch with her illusion and lands a strike she is sure has killed it, confidently ignoring it as she approaches Kyubei. It's here that we get the briefly held suspicion confirmed this witch was indeed a recurring threat for Kyoko. She tells Kyubei that she finally got revenge on it, but her celebration is cut short by Kyubei alerting her that the witch is still moving behind her. Mami hangs back at this time, watching from afar as the witch takes a hold of Kyoko, catching the redhead off guard and overpowering her quickly. Right as it seems like all hope is lost, Mami makes her entrance and attacks the witch herself, forcing it to free Kyoko. As it turns out, the witch uses the same kind of illusion magic that Kyoko herself has access to, something that the redhead was clearly not prepared to deal with. Mami doesn't quite finish off the enemy yet, instead taking the time to check on Kyoko first. Kyoko naturally attempts to get Mami's name, but in another instance of this story mirroring the anime's first episode, Mami brushes off the need for introductions and refocuses her attention squarely on the witch. We see Mami taking the leadership role that we'd later associate her with in the main series, where she now instructs Kyoko succinctly in battle. She'll fight the body, while Kyoko's job is to target the core located in the witch's weapon. The fight goes smoothly from there, with the pair quickly adapting to each other's style and Kyoko scoring the killing blow on the witch. A detail that I want to bring up here is that the way Kyoko kills the witch is framed somewhat similarly to how she kills Octavia in the main series, throwing herself into a spear strike to hit a central point with all of her strength. Here, the central point is the witch's core, and of course in the main canon, it's her soul gem. An interesting implication that we can make here is that Kyoko's first and last fights as a magical girl go down the exact same way, which is some nice narrative flexing by the writer, turning what could have been a boring retcon into a really nice visual callback. Once the fight reaches its conclusion, Mami and Kyoko introduce themselves. We learn Kyoko is from Mitakihara's neighboring district, Kazamino City, meaning she deliberately crossed over into Mitakihara for this particular witch, an observation that Mami probes into as magical girls don't usually go into districts that aren't their own. As speculated by her earlier dialogue, that witch is in fact one that Kyoko had previously fought, but not just that, it's the very first witch she ever fought as a magical girl. Named Asafe, this witch actually debuted in the third of the four drama CDs for the series. As I stated prior, the first volume of the different story is an adaptation of that exact audio drama, so it's nice to see that be continued here. In that story, we learn that there was a witch that Kyoko let escape in her years as a rookie, and get a physical description of it that matches the one that we actually get to see here. Continuing with the story, Kyoko apologizes for crossing territories and attempts to leave until Mami tries her usual helping hand gesture, offering the grief seed dropped by Asafe to the girl. It seems like we're going to get a repeat of the prologue as Kyoko says she did nothing to earn the grief seed herself, but Mami shuts it down and they both share it to cleanse their soul gems. Obviously, this attitude is starkly different to the Kyoko we're used to. The main canon Kyoko would have hoarded grief seeds for herself. But I want to focus on this difference for a reason beyond that, as it exposes a side of Kyoko that most fans probably wouldn't associate with her. The different story introduces Kyoko as modest. Kyoko literally just said she had been tracking down this witch for some time so it didn't cause more trouble, even going as far as crossing into opposing territory just to stop it. Her fighting style allowed Mami to figure out its weak point, and Kyoko herself even delivered the killing blow to Asafe. And yet, right after, she's telling Mami that she did, quote, nothing to deserve the grief seed that dropped. I don't think this is like the usual magical girls shouldn't help each other mentality we saw from the two girls in the prologue. Instead, let's consider this being a result of her background. We know that Kyoko is a religious girl. She grew up in a family devoted to the faith, with her father being a preacher. It's highly likely that her modesty comes from religious teachings, maybe even thinking that she shouldn't accept charity but should instead always give it. I think by attempting to knock back the grief seed that Mami gives her, she's not being a stubborn kid, she's trying to, in her own way, be charitable and give it to Mami instead. It's just that her way of articulating this intent is very poor, but let's cut her some slack. She's like, what, 13? We know she's generous deep down. So many times she offers food to people in the main series and side stories and goes out of her way to help Sayaka and Madoka when the former is beginning to fall to despair. Kyoko is not like the magical girls who would traditionally turn down help, and that instantly makes her an incredible foil to Mami, as both have these masks. One of being a no-nonsense hero who is actually reaching out for a friend, and one of being a hardened lone wolf warrior who really wants to help as many people as she can. Speaking of reaching out, the next page has Mami make the biggest reach we have seen her do thus far, and she invites Kyoko to her house. Kyoko is overwhelmed by the food Mami offers, and her modest nature returns again when she calls herself shameless for eating it, prompting Mami to point out that she invited Kyoko over. Let's take a look at the point we discussed earlier about transactional friendship. So, Mami believes that any connection is probably fleeting, and moreover, that it is going to be transactional. I think what makes this interesting in particular is Mommy doesn't just have store-bought pastries and cakes, she is going out of her way to make this food. If Mommy's worldview is to be believed, and all of her connections are purely transactional, then look at how much effort she puts into something she already thinks isn't going to lead to anything. Baking isn't exactly easy, trust me, I've tried once. It requires some patience to get it done. Mommy is putting in extra effort into making food for people she thinks won't even care after the meal's done. But why? Well, because it might lead to something. Mommy, despite resigning to this idea of perpetual loneliness, still holds on to the hope that someone might notice her, and we know this is true given the original series. In episode 3, right before the confrontation with Charlotte, Mommy literally breaks down at the thought, the mere idea that Monica's understanding of her situation means she's willing to stand with her and be her friend. No matter how long it's been, Mommy continues to hold onto the hope that a genuine friend will step into her life one day, and it's most importantly shown in her actions in that she makes the food for her guests herself. Think of it this way. If there was a guest like, say, Madoka. If Madoka came over and was thinking of being Mommy's friend, but Mommy gave her food that she could have purchased herself from the store, then the impression is that Mommy doesn't really put effort in for people that she'd like to be closer to. On the flip side, if Madoka is served food made by Mommy herself, it shows initiative and proves that Mommy is committed to making a connection. Granted, it could also just be a routine. In fact, I'm certain a good chunk of this behavior is just a result of a routine Mommy has slotted herself into, but nonetheless, it does expose a lot about her in my opinion, and it's why this story is so fascinating. We're literally only a single chapter in, and we can already pick apart the type of character that both Mommy and Kyoko are in such great detail. Now, as a reviewer, I am obviously also working with the knowledge of events yet to come at this point in the story, but it's not like I'm pulling these connections out of thin air. At least, I don't think so. We are dealing with a trusted and competent writer for this work, Hanokage. Now, I don't know if Hanokage is male, female, non-binary, intersex, whatever, and I didn't want to go snooping around for details, so I will just refer to Hanokage as they, them in regards to pronouns. Now, Hanokage is not a household name, but they are responsible for the original manga adaptation of the series and its recent remaster, as well as serving as a featured artist for many parts of the franchise. They have been involved in the series since practically day one, and they know these characters well. I don't want to speak on behalf of Hanokage, but I believe these additions and details were 100% intentional because of how much was truly meant for characters like Kyoko and Mami. My fangirling admiration for Hanokage aside, the next page changes tone just slightly as we focus on Kyoko again. Kyoko admits her inexperience, even saying that she still learned a lot from the brief talk she and Mami have been having while the food was being prepared. It's very likely that Kyoko's wish was made within the current month, especially since she is so surprised at how Mami uses her magic. She compliments Mami's strength and capabilities, and then, in a sudden burst of excitement and desperation, she asks if Mami would teach her the ways of being a magical girl directly. The first spectacular chapter of this volume ends with Mami left absorbing the bombshell of a question thrust upon her by this rookie magical girl, no doubt assuming she must have misheard. Chapter 1 sets the stage perfectly. It has the right amount of intrigue built upon the reader's knowledge of Kyoko and Mami, and leaves breadcrumbs for us to follow to piece together amazingly accurate emotional profiles for the pair. Even if Mami and Kyoko might not have gotten all the screen time in the world to flourish originally, Mami especially, there's no shortage of depth given to both of them. Hanokage takes what we, the viewers and readers, would already know about them and starts to mold them into further fleshed out characters before any real conflict even begins. Of course, none of that would even be possible without the audio drama farewell story, so we must also praise Hiramatsu-san for his incredible original script. And this, yep, it's only the first chapter. We have 3 more to go through for Volume 1 and a lot of ground to cover, so let's not waste any time. The second chapter wastes no time picking up after that bombshell of an ending from before. We're in school with Mami the following day, where we learn that she has been in such a good mood all day that even her classmates recognized it. The realization immediately turns into asking Mami if what has made her so happy is that she's got a boyfriend. I think it's fairly interesting how romance is equated to happiness so often in this franchise. Now, okay, yeah, I get that it's probably a weird thing to hear. Of course, romance is probably going to make you happy if you're inherently a romantic person. But what I mean is that in particular, we see romance brought up as like, I don't know, a first instinct to being happy. In the main series, as we touched upon in the first chapter review, we have Mami list some cons to Madoka about becoming a magical girl, and one of the things she says is that Madoka would miss out on having a boyfriend. And now here we see Mami's friends instantly assume that because she's happy, she must have a boyfriend. So what does this all mean? It means that clearly to be happy as a magical girl, you need to be a lesbian. What I think it means is something we'd later see in Rebellion and perhaps even touched upon in Walpurgis Nacht Rising. Consider Akuma Homura. Her transformation and ability to overpower part of the law of cycles for long enough to steal a portion of its power was because of her deeply devoted, maybe toxic, love for Madoka. Love is, as told and shown to us point blank, an incredible and fundamental source of power. Moreover, it's a power that the incubators cannot possibly hope to understand. You can't observe love, and you can't quantify love. And to the incubators, where to see is to understand that there exists an unknowable power that's, quote, deeper than despair and greater than hope is truly horrific. What I think we should zero in on whenever this whole, oh, you must have fallen in love thing gets brought up is that it's actually highly likely an important backbone of the series just waiting to be used properly, but one that's been set up from the very beginning and continues to be referenced again. What were we talking about again? Right. Classroom gossip. Welcome to the Luca Magica channel, folks. Right, so Mami clarifies to her classmates that no, her good mood is not the result of finding a boyfriend, but rather finding a friend. Her classmates are surprised, even going as far as asking if that means they aren't her friends. Another interesting addition to the cake conundrum of the first chapter, we see that these two do appear to see Mami as a genuine friend, and I believe that they must be, otherwise I find it hard to believe that they'd even care about a change in mood like this. But I do find it interesting that maybe Mami doesn't fully consider these girls to be her friends, maybe out of a fear of eventually accidentally dragging them into the world of magic. I mean, it makes sense, though as I will continue to argue in Mami's case, it feels more like what she believes she must do. Whether or not she really does need to separate it is another question entirely. Still, the different story and farewell story both clearly got what makes Mami tick, and it is loneliness beyond simply saying, I'm lonely. That's not to suggest Akiyuki Shinbo and Ganarabuchi didn't write Mami's loneliness well. I think they did with what little space they had to work with her. But Hanokage's approach is very much needed and appreciated, as it places more emphasis on the idea that it's not simply that Mami is lonely, but rather that she is isolating and seemingly purposefully so. In any case, Mami further clarifies. She explains that the newfound friendship with Kyoko feels a bit different to her and describes an intimate and profound connection that she says relies on them making sure that they have each other's backs and that it will only last if they can truly trust one another. It's here that we see an example of that stubborn light of hope that still lives within Mami. She essentially fantasizes about the future of her relationship with this newfound friend, saying that even if she isn't sure about how it's going to turn out, she loves the idea that they could become so close that they could trust each other with their lives if need be. Personally, I see a romantic reading of this. The framing of the panel even shows Mami's hands held together with her soul gem ring visible as she pictures an ideal outcome for herself and Kyoko. The artistic choice feels very deliberate to me, and even if it wasn't 100% intentional, it is hard to look at this and not see some level of subtext. I mean, we're talking about Mami, a character starved of any kind of love for multiple years at this point, very suddenly having someone willingly step into her life in a way that's unlike anyone before. Is it really so implausible to picture Mami having a crush on Kyoko? Personally, I don't think so, but I do understand that romance probably wasn't on the forefront of ideas for this story, and so this can obviously be read at face value too. The follow up from Mami's classmates is rather funny, but also meant to show the disconnect between the world of magic and the normal human realm. One says that Mami's words must imply that the person she found is obviously not just a boyfriend but a fiancé, which completely shuts Mami down in comedic fashion before they part ways. After that intro, the following pages go back to the prior evening for us to see exactly what went down between Kyoko and Mami after the former sprung the surprisingly loaded question on the latter. Kyoko is incredibly impressionable and moreover willing to learn the quote-unquote right way as Mami sees it. Naturally for her it must be overwhelming, that's the impression we are left with from the prior chapter's ending. And to further drive this point home, Kyoko in this chapter straight up calls Mami a perfect magical girl in every way. It's kind of a dangerous thing to say to somebody like Mami, but obviously not because she has a massive ego. The praise won't go to her head. In fact, Mami seems to hate praise, as seen in the original anime when she breaks down about needing to live up to the praise, but feeling like she isn't deserving of it. My favorite example of this kind of imposter syndrome in fiction comes from Dan Salvato's Doki Doki Literature Club and the character of Sayori. Outwardly, Sayori is a bundle of sunshine, but internally she is fighting a very cruel but quiet battle. Before her passing in the game, literally the day before, the player can talk to Sayori and learn about one of her biggest struggles, which is receiving praise. She says that being cheered on and getting praise hurts her so much to hear because of her own self-perceived inadequacy. I easily see this in Mami too. So Kyoko telling her she is the best magical girl bar none means that Mami probably will internalize it and try to keep being perfect, just so her newfound admirer and friend doesn't think any less of her. But the different story actually does something really fascinating when it comes to these two as far as a pairing is concerned. So when Kyoko asks to be Mami's apprentice, we get a slight pause from Mami, which, as you're reading, may shockingly come across as though she's about to turn down the request. In actuality, her answer immediately exposes a flaw between these two that's going to be the core of their conflict much later in the volume. Kyoko's desire is to be mentored because she wants to be better at her job as a magical girl. Mami's desire is to get a friend out of all of this. Now, yes, I'm sure the idea of a new friendship is something Kyoko likes too, but the priority is what I am mostly interested in here. Mami's only reference towards the specific request of Kyoko being her apprentice is to literally say that what she's about to propose isn't exactly the same as a mentor-apprentice relationship. From the word go, Mami's priorities are inwardly focused on the idea of having Kyoko be her friend. Yes, she will obviously still mentor Kyoko, but Mami very clearly isn't entirely on the same page as the other girl. It's not like it's bad to want a friend, naturally, but to understand why Kyoko and Mami's relationship will later sever so badly, we need to see the seeds planted here at the very start. As expected, Mami agrees to mentor Kyoko. Another thing I want to point out is that Mami isn't the only one not meeting Kyoko's priorities, it goes the other way too. When Mami says she always wanted a magical girl as a friend, Kyoko doesn't even respond to that, as she is more focused on her own priorities than meeting Mami halfway, at least verbally. It's not like they can't be friends, they obviously will be, but once again, I want to hammer in how important this first day of their relationship is and how it lays the groundwork for their breakup later. It is an excellent use of foreshadowing by Hanokage. The following pages show Mami and Kyoko clicking into place as a team, working together, and eventually Mami praises Kyoko for her improvement, even going as far as saying that she has been able to rely on her a lot. In response, Kyoko says she'll find time to cross over to Mitakihara City again in the future and calls Mami her senpai before leaving for home. So, the idea of the senpai kohai dynamic is rooted in Japanese cultural history that extends far beyond what the modern media zeitgeist depicts. In short, calling someone your senpai would traditionally mean that you see, acknowledge, and respect their authority over you in the particular profession or education you are learning. It is a heavy honorific to give someone when used appropriately. It shows a level of care and respect for the superior, but based on cultural history and the economic changes in Japan since the 1990s, it's also a touchy subject for some. Some people find fear in being a kohai because of the social pressure. If a kohai were to be better than their senpai, it reflects poorly on them, and it's something that the kohai might need to or feel obligated to apologize for. I bring this up because I want to analyze Mami's reaction not only to this, but how Mami herself acts when she later becomes Madoka and Sayaka's de facto senpai in the original anime. We'll actually start with the anime. If you recall, during the second episode, Mami basically forces herself into the role of teacher for Madoka and Sayaka. She actively puts in a lot of effort to be the best possible teacher for them and even prioritizes something in her fight with Gertrude that we can potentially call antithetical to her character. When she's trapped by Gertrude, Mami's response is not to prioritize safety, but to make sure she doesn't look bad or uncool in front of her juniors, as it is read in the localized version of the series. If we compare this to the fights against Asafe and the unnamed witch in the different story, we see Mami is not actually one to show off. And now, if we look at her reaction to Kyoko calling her senpai, we can further validate this interpretation. Mami is overwhelmed by the sudden label, and it tracks with how her character has been written so far. She is absolutely not someone who would naturally consider herself superior to anybody, and it's probably also why her first thought when accepting Kyoko's request in the first place is not about the act of teaching. Now, when I said her need to not be uncool in front of Madoka and Sayaka could be antithetical, that's true only if you look at it on the surface and just treat the different story as a retcon. Instead, we should approach it with a bit more nuance. It's really interesting to think of this from the angle of Mami growing into that kind of character over time. Even here, sure, she isn't exactly on board right away, but we see her slowly adapting to the idea as she gives it some thought. It's a fascinating evolution to consider and only adds to the idea of Mami associating things with friendship. It's like she internalizes specific interactions or words and interprets it as a checklist, so to speak, of things to do to make a friend. If I meticulously prepare a lot of food, present myself as highly capable and serious, and never show weakness or lack of knowledge, I'm sure to be trusted as a friend, essentially, a mindset which seems to have found its origins here, starting with Kyoko calling Mami her senpai. As we continue through this chapter, Mami explains her method for witch hunting, which is the same as we see in the show, crowded areas and spots that have a lot of negative energy. Then we get onto Mami discussing her wish with Kyoko. Now, I don't want to actually go in depth on Mami's wish because that's not only been done to death, but there's actually something else here that I think is pretty important. So this might be one of my favorite moments for Kyoko in the entire franchise. Mami explains her rationale as we have come to expect. Because she got a second chance to live, she wants to make sure absolutely nobody goes through the same pain she has endured, and moreover, she doesn't want people to have to grieve like she has had to. Of course, we know there's a little bit more to it than that, but Mami chooses to only share that much with Kyoko at this point. Now, let's talk about Kyoko. Kyoko is naturally apologetic, but remember, this is the same Kyoko who is the daughter of a preacher and believes in the positive messages he is trying to spread, including charity. Now, charity doesn't necessarily just mean giving money or food to someone, it can also mean being non judgmental to another person, listening, essentially. As Kyoko listens to the tail end of Mami's explanation, some interesting blocking is used. So Mami essentially says she's grateful for Kyoko joining her as nobody has ever been able to truly understand how and why she fights the way she does. While she is saying this, we are focused entirely on Kyoko's reaction, and the artist draws her in shadow without her eyes being visible. If we look back at what we learned early in the chapter, we know that Mami and Kyoko began this relationship in a way where they were both trying to get something different out of it. Over time, that has naturally started to mellow out, as Mami is able to teach Kyoko just fine, and Kyoko in turn begins to see Mami as a friend. The blocking here reminds me visually of how it looks earlier when Mami is talking about wanting a friend in response to Kyoko's request, which may have been an intentional callback because it's a discussion that's also about a deeper insecurity within Mami. But you may be asking why this is one of my favorite Kyoko moments, right? Well, it's what happens after that makes it so, and it is the best example of how emotionally intelligent Kyoko is. So Mami's been pouring her guts out about how much she appreciates Kyoko's friendship and talking about how nobody else has seen her for who she is before, and Kyoko's response once the talk is done is kind of brilliant in my opinion. She invites Mami over to her home in Kazumino City. Kyoko's home is a church, and if we consider this religious context, then I think Kyoko's actions are trying to give Mami even more room to have a friend or someone to confide in, that being God or whichever higher power Kyoko's religion believes in. Of course, we can't overlook the other obvious fact here, which just makes this even better and further proves Kyoko's intelligence. Mami's admission is about how she lost her family, and Kyoko's home is with her own family. She is essentially extending her hand out to let Mami in and be with a family again. And it's clear it's the one thing she has truly been missing and needs more than anything. You gotta remember too, at this point the pair have no reason to assume anything could drive them apart, so Kyoko must fully expect this to become a regular occurrence and for Mami to essentially become a member of the Sakura family in no time. Speaking of, let's actually talk about the Sakura family because this is the first time we get to truly explore them as a living, breathing unit. The first person we see in Kyoko's family here is her little sister Momo. Momo quickly attaches herself to Mami, immediately calling her One-chan, i.e. Big Sis. When we think of Mami as a caregiver or older sister figure, Momo as a catalyst for that is interesting to consider, and I'd go as far as to say that if the events of the different story, at least the parts adapted from Farewell Story, are considered canon, then Momo's view of Mami may have informed how Mami treats Bebe in the Rebellion story. When you think about it, Bebe is a lot like Kyoko role-wise. She is a friend of Mami's whose role is someone who suddenly stepped in during a dark time when Mami had nobody else. Not for nothing, but Bebe is also predominantly red or pink like Kyoko and Momo, and she has an obsession with food akin to Kyoko. Moving on, we also see Kyoko's mother, who seems like a nice lady, but how she is drawn implies she's pretty stressed or tired, likely in part because of Momo's hyperactivity. She apologizes for not being able to make a bigger meal for Mami, but Kyoko shuts that down by saying it would have only made her feel awkward. Another great read on Kyoko's behalf, as of course by now she would probably have picked up on Mami's perfectionism. And then we meet the father. Papa Sakura, as he has no official name, is a very complex character to talk about in my opinion. Of course, we all know that he succumbs to madness and performs the most unforgivable act later, but I appreciate that the different story, and of course some of Portable too, was able to give us more time with him beyond Kyoko's word of mouth saying he was a nice guy before it all went down. When we are introduced to Papa Sakura, he is incredibly modest, even with his newfound success, and we instantly see where Kyoko gets her modesty from. I never got around to watching her video, but fellow YouTuber Judgmental Critter has been going over the designs of the Puella Magi Madoka Magica cast for some time now, and one of her shorts popped onto my feed earlier this year with a title that read something along the lines of "Kyoko is designed like her father." Without watching it or the full video, yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, but I also want to look beyond just the design. Papa Sakura is a preacher. He is trying to extend his teachings to as many people as possible, but the message he is trying to spread, while positive, goes against the orthodox views of his religion, which is where the animosity towards him and his family comes from. In the main series, when Kyoko arrives, we are primed to expect a certain status quo established by Mami and promised to be upheld by Sayaka now that she is a magical girl. Kyoko's views are ones that go against the views of the heroines of the story and us, the viewers, at that point. Sure, we know that the life of a magical girl isn't sunshine and rainbows, but we still think of magical girls as heroic saviors at this point. Kyoko's very introduction, whether she knows it or not, makes her just like her father in that moment. Both of them are preachers imposing their own views onto an established system that goes against everything else and makes them come across as the villains because of it. But what makes this even more fascinating is that in truth, Kyoko actually represents the orthodox nature of the magical girl system, and the ones closer to mirroring her father are in fact Mami and Sayaka. Based on how Kyoko viewed her father, Papa Sakura's message was about acceptance and kindness and helping as many people as possible. We don't know the true mission of his religion, but if this aggressively kind view was taken as imposing, we might instantly imagine a modern conservative view on religion. Mami and Sayaka are idealists, like it seems Papa Sakura was as a preacher, and in her anime debut, Kyoko's role aligns more with the people who villainized and ostracized her own family. Of course, we know this is a mask, and Kyoko does eventually go back to her true nature when it comes time to fight Octavia von Sakendorf, but I think it's interesting to look at Kyoko as a mirror not only to her father, but to everything surrounding him, including his naysayers. Maybe she became hardened and selfish to directly scorn her father as retribution, but we'll discuss the tragedy when it comes. For now, let's actually look at what this scene is. Papa Sakura admits to Mami that not too long ago he would have been too embarrassed to even invite someone over to eat due to their circumstances as a low-income family. As he recounts his struggles and the toil his failed preaching was bringing to his family, and eventually speaks about the sudden miracle that came to him, Mami instantly pieces together the truth about how exactly that went down. That story continues on, but eventually it comes time for Mami to leave, and we get the major emotional peak of the chapter as she and Kyoko have a talk outside. Kyoko confirms what Mami is already suspecting. Papa Sakura's sudden success was the result of her contract with Kyubey. After explaining this further to Mami about how she couldn't understand why people didn't believe her father the same way she did, she immediately asks if her wish was somehow wrong or weird. Of course, Mami doesn't believe that at all. Her pause is coming from a realization that goes on to, in my opinion, truly shape her into the Mami Tomoe that we know from the anime. Mami mentions thinking about how such a wish like Kyoko's would have been better in her mind. She could have saved her parents and not just herself. As a result of thinking that, she sees the danger of being a magical girl as the price she must now pay for making her wish and getting to live. In my mind, this feeds directly into the core of her hero complex. It's not just that Mami thinks she has to make her wish worthwhile or do the best she can with a second chance at life. I believe that Mami deeply regrets not taking more time to make her wish more impactful, and now has to go overboard to compensate for what she no doubt sees as her greatest failure. Mami doesn't even stop to consider that she really couldn't do much else with the time she had, so she is not truly at fault for not making the correct wish. Sure, she says it to both Madoka and Sayaka that she didn't have much time to think, but whether she believes that is a different story entirely. It's not even really that. It's the idea that Kyoko's wish was selfless that it sets her apart not just from other magical girls that Mami has met, but it even sets her apart from Mami herself. This ties back into the idea of the senpai-kohai dynamic and the fear of outshining your senpai expressed throughout some parts of Japanese culture. I think Mami sees Kyoko as better than her in this moment and is jealous about it, even if only for a little bit. Kyoko represents this idealized view she had about magical girls and how she tried to present herself. The key point here being that Kyoko doesn't just represent it, she is how Mami would picture the ideal magical girl. Kyoko made one of the most selfless wishes in the series, and in this early stage of her career, she intends to act upon it to her fullest. And much like Papa Sakura and his newfound success, Kyoko remains humble and modest about this sudden growth and ability to do good. For Kyoko and her father, success isn't the key, it's the ability to spread a message that they believe in. So long as they can do that, they seem to be happy. Thankfully, this talk between Mami and Kyoko only serves to strengthen their bond as they resolve to continue fighting together. For the next few pages, we are shown a montage of the pair tracking down a new witch to its barrier as Mami monologues going over much of what we have already discussed in regards to how she views Kyoko. We already know all of what Mami is confirming here, but there is a small panel dedicated to a nice little piece of world building. Remember during the review of the first chapter I said to keep Kyoko's illusory magic in mind? It'll be more important later, but here it is that we learn that Mami named it Rosso Phantasma. It also implies that Mami named her own finishing move and might have named all the moves that are called out by name among the Holy Quintet in the Rebellion story. The next page gives a brief mention to the rumor of Walpurgisnacht and is mostly there to show Kyoko's confidence in herself and Mami, saying she believes that they'd be able to beat it rather easily. From here, it seems like we start to slow down for a bit as the chapter comes to a close, but the tension intrusively begins to pick right back up. We're back at the Sakura house late at night. Both Kyoko and Momo are shown to be asleep when the former's soul gem manifests and awakens her. Of course, Kyubei is right there at her bedroom window to tell her something is up, but she doesn't even need to be told as she can already smell something foul outside. As it turns out, a group of people were struck by the curse of a witch and gathered at the church Kyoko's father owns, threatening to ignite a pile of books on fire to set the entire building ablaze. Naturally, Kyoko goes right into protector mode as soon as she realizes the gravity of the situation, jumping in to stop the immediate danger of the fire by snagging a box of matches free from one of the victims and clearing them away. Of course, the main problem is still the witch lurking nearby, so Kyoko jumps into its barrier and tracks it down with great efficiency. The battle itself is illustrated nicely, of course, but something I really like is how Hanokage depicts Rosso Phantasma, and it makes me sad that this ability is not anywhere else in the franchise in a meaningful way. There's a panel where we see 5 copies of Kyoko being commanded by the real one, and each one has a different pose and expression which I believe are meant to emulate each member of the Holy Quintet as a nice visual Easter egg. I have color-coded each one I believe to be a reference. So much potential for epic animations and fight sequences are hidden behind Rosso Phantasma, so I really hope Walpurgisnacht Rising features the attack. She eventually beats the witch, but the aftermath it left behind is the real focus of Kyoko's worries. Several unconscious citizens among books covered with gasoline now remain for her to clean up, but luckily enough, daylight has not yet come, giving her plenty of time to try and fix everything up. There's just one problem. Papa Sakura is awake and aware of what just happened. And if you're an anime viewer, your mind is probably racing because you know exactly what's coming next. But of course, the different story ends its second chapter on a cliffhanger, Papa Sakura approaching Kyoko in the church. And man, again, what an incredible chapter. Halfway through the first volume and we already have an incredible fleshed out understanding of both our main leads, expanding them both in ways we might not have been able to get from just the anime. Even though we know what's coming, now that we have so much more context and understanding, we are left bracing for this tragedy in a brand new way. How that unfolds is something we will have to stew on until we head on over to the third chapter. Right off the bat, this chapter does an incredible job of setting up the immense tension of the tragedy about to unfold. Without even getting too much into it yet, it honestly feels like almost any page could be the one where it happens. It's a fairly clever way of handling this. As I said towards the end of the second chapter, we already know what's about to happen, so dragging it out and using the reader's expectations against them is a great way of reinventing the way we will process and maybe even react to it. Prequels can tend to shoehorn in ideas or concepts to force them to fit into pre-existing lore that is meant to come after it, but sometimes that shoehorning can lead to what's known as a retcon. In simple terms, retroactive continuity, or retconning, is a way for information to find its way into a story we already knew and change how we view that story. Sometimes this can be good, we can get further context for things and deepen our understanding of the characters and the world. But of course, other times it can just be disappointing, making the story needlessly complicated or adding in pointless expansion for no reason. The different story thankfully doesn't do the whole bad retcon thing, and by the time you get to the point where the story converges into an alternate timeline, we're already going to be very invested in this world anyway, that the fact that it becomes its own thing is incredibly exciting. In any case, the different story is a prequel done right. It's a good expansion that actually felt needed. Both Mami and Kyoko, while great in their own ways in the original series, were always given the short end of the stick when it comes to the story, so a fully fleshed out expansion finally makes them feel like full characters. But we need to finally talk about the contents of this chapter, so here we go. We open up back in the main household of the Sakura family, presumably the same night as the witch attack we just saw, and we see Momo waking up to a noise. She's first looking for Kyoko in her tired state, and is still so out of it that she doesn't realize her dad is standing in the bedroom doorway draped in shadows. She asks what's going on, and Papa Sakura just stares at her, reaching out his hand and he rubs her head. He calmly apologizes for waking her up and reassures her nothing is wrong, ushering her back to bed with a simple goodnight. Momo walks away without noticing her sister standing next to their father in her magical girl outfit. So, yeah. We get a taste of that incredibly high tension right away, but also a wonderful use of narrative ebb and flow. Again, we know Papa Sakura is going to snap. We know this has to be the chapter, but the execution, for lack of a better term, is crucial for turning this from a mere retelling into something extraordinary. There's another factor to this building of tension that I really like, but we'll discuss that shortly. Let's get into the start of the story after this chapter's prologue. After that short intro, we're back with Mami and Kyoko at the former's apartment with a page that seems to mirror the post-prologue page of the second chapter, even down to having specific panels that were focused on Mami in that chapter now focused on Kyoko in this one. Mami instantly notices that Kyoko is in a sour mood and pushes for some kind of answer as to what is wrong. Naturally, Kyoko brushes off the question and goes into one of her own. Before we even get into the question itself, we need to look at how Kyoko talks here. She addresses Mami with the honorific san as opposed to her prior use of senpai. Of course, san is the Japanese equivalent of Mr. or Mrs. in English. In the last chapter, we went in depth about how important the use of senpai was for Kyoko and why using it for Mami was such a big deal. We have gone from Kyoko calling Mami her teacher and superior to her now just effectively saying Ms. Mami. It's not quite Tomoe-san or Ms. Tomoe yet, but it's kinda getting there. Now, there's a couple of ways to read this, right? One way would be that enough time has passed where Kyoko feels comfortable enough to use more casual honorifics for Mami, which is valid. Another reading might be that maybe Kyoko and Mami view each other closer to equals now than the strict student-teacher dynamic that they started with, also an entirely reasonable view of this change. I have a slightly different take on this, but we need some more context, so let's put a pin in this and continue with the scene first. So Kyoko's question is about whether or not Mami's ideals have earned her scorn from other magical girls, whether she has butted heads with them or not over why she works the way she does. Mami says she hasn't quite gotten into confrontations with anyone over it, but does say that her methods make her feel like she's inevitably going to keep getting distant from everyone. She can't exactly expect magical girls to get along like normal people, as she puts it, and actually interacting with her non-magical girl classmates is getting harder as she settles further into her duties. Despite this, she doesn't regret her choices as she has a companion, Kyoko. Kyoko does not comment on that though, but further continues with a specific and troubling line of questioning. She notes that Mami believes those killed by witches will always have someone to remember them, but she also asks if Mami believes the opposite could be true. Kyoko's thought process is this: would saving someone who was under the curse of a witch only lead to something else that ends up being worse? Her example is the possible social aftermath of saving someone from an attempt on their own life. Sure, on one hand, the immediate tragedy of their suicide is avoided, but if someone witnesses that, what then? What happens if the survivor becomes ostracized and treated as mad? Does being a hero even matter if, in the end, the tragedy they prevent just ends up making the situation worse? Mommy asks what is probably on the reader's minds too, if Kyoko's query is in regards to whatever has caused her to be in such a visibly terrible mood, and more specifically if it is related to her family. Kyoko says no, framing it as a mere hypothetical, lamenting the difficulty of trying to explain the world of magic to someone who could never understand. Mommy actually concedes a little bit, agreeing that the work of a magical girl can't be called perfect or entirely for the best, but she admonishes Kyoko for using the possibility that she proposed as an excuse to not do her best, warning her off of it. She comforts Kyoko as best she can, offering a helping hand and a chance to talk if she needs it. So about that change in honorifics. The entire question more or less foreshadows exactly what is going to happen in the fourth chapter. Mami and Kyoko will break up over their clashing ideals. Now that much is obvious to any fan of the show and anyone who has read this before, but I think it's foreshadowed immediately by Kyoko saying Mami-san. Think about this for a moment. When she is fully on board with Mami's ideals and teachings, Kyoko is perfectly, unquestioningly Mami's kohai. She says Mami Senpai as respect for who she is, deference to her superior skill and power, and acknowledgement of her teachings. Now, by dropping the senpai honorific, Kyoko is also, in effect, dropping everything else that comes with calling someone their senpai. Another fantastic thing in this scene is the continued use of tension and an ambiguous timeline. Unless you've read this story before and know what's on the following page, you have no clue when this talk takes place. For all we know, the rest of the Sakura family might have already met their end by the time Kyoko is here talking to Mami. Even what she is saying is very specific, isn't it? She mentions suicide and madness. The two things we commonly associate with Papa Sakura as anime viewers. We know he is going to snap and commit a murder-suicide. And just in case it wasn't already on your mind, which is unlikely, the narrative nudges it back into your peripheral by having Mommy ask if Kyoko's talking about her family. I keep saying it, but it's a fantastic use of building tension and recontextualizing how we see this tragedy unfold. But as we continue further into the chapter, we learn that no, the event still hasn't occurred. Kyoko returns to her home in Kazumino and things are looking worse for wear. The people outside the church are now very obviously, off in the way Madoka Magica often portrays things like mind control or enchantments, a direct result of Kyoko's wish. Inside, too, it feels horribly oppressive. Kyoko reaches her father's study only to be met with several empty bottles of sake on the floor. She offhandedly mentions to her father how it's only going to hurt him in the long run, but it obviously doesn't reach him. She then really tries to talk to him. She details a successful witch hunt she had today, and we learn that the hunt she described involved saving a cursed citizen from taking their life, telling us that her hypothetical Tamami was in fact real, just not how we may have expected it to be. Another fantastic subversion from Hanokage. Kyoko says something rather important here, and something that perhaps she shouldn't have said. She says she's doing what he is, trying to cut away at the root of all evil as he has described, and that by doing so she can't be doing a bad thing. She says that she still loves her father's teachings and that seeing him happy that people were listening was what has inspired her to keep going. Interestingly, the panel in which Kyoko says she loves her father's teachings is framed with a focus on her hands and specifically on her soul gem ring. It's a visual callback to the similar scene in the second chapter when Mami is discussing her newfound friendship with Kyoko to her classmates. It's another instance of love being said in conjunction with a framing of the ring, and it feels rather deliberate to me, but you know my thoughts on love in this universe already, so let's not get derailed again this time. It's just a neat visual callback that I wanted to point out. But of course, we finally get the first thread of tension snapping as Papa Sakura makes his response. He specifically latches onto Kyoko saying that he became happy and calls it an illusion. He disavows the idea of Kyoko's arguments because he believes everyone drawn to his church were just doing so because of an enchantment and not because of their own faith. He scorns Kyoko for her wish, saying that the people who came are essentially just sacrifices, the price tag on selling her soul to the devil. Naturally, Kyoko tries to argue against this even as her own father calls her a witch, but Papa Sakura continues. He begins to believe that literally nobody was ever listening to him and his teachings, and that included Kyoko. It culminates in him viewing himself as a failure of a father because the existence of what Kyoko described makes his teachings, from his perspective, pointless. It's easy to just skip to the end of the story and say that Papa Sakura is evil because he killed his family, and I'm not going to argue that he isn't in the wrong for committing such an unforgivable sin. Of course he is. But something the different story does well with him is explore the nuance that is present with him. I may be one of few people to do so, but I really think it's worth seriously exploring this man a bit more rather than just labeling him evil and calling it a day. We have to consider the facts. It seems that Papa Sakura was not always like this. Sure, we don't know his entire backstory, but everything we see of him before the snap paints a picture of a man trying and failing time and again to provide for his family. The best way he believed he could do this was to spread his message of positivity. Papa Sakura has always had a profound and restrictive flaw, but it is not that he was a drunkard or a murderous psychopath. Papa Sakura was rigid to a fault. Kyoko and Momo might have looked up to him and loved him and his teachings, but we need to consider the bigger picture here. From the get-go, Kyoko's father was being led astray, not by religion, but by the ideals he so forcibly held to, a standard, an impossibly high standard. Sounding familiar? From the very beginning of this story, we see Mami facing the same kind of social rejection within a system she believed in, but her stubbornness prevented her from being able to step away from it. She clings to the ideal she has in regards to it like her life depends on it, even if it means needing to hold herself to an impossible standard. As far as we know, neither are necessarily wrong about their beliefs. They both seem to come from a profoundly well-meaning and positive point of view. But again, the flaw is their refusal to accept anything going against their perceived view of a perfect world. This is why Mami and Kyoko will split. Not because Kyoko suddenly just wants to be evil and leave Mami to be alone, but because Mami is now very obviously mirroring her father's worst flaws. It's not just Kyoko who is like her father in this story, Mami is like him too. Let's talk a bit more about the wording here, because there's some obvious but still very cool use of language here. So Papa Sakura accuses Kyoko of being a witch. Naturally, Kyoko says magical girls and witches are nothing alike because the difference is that magical girls don't kill people. However, we obviously know that this is not entirely true. It's fantastically ironic that Papa Sakura says magical girls and witches may as well be one and the same because witches do, in fact, emerge from the grief of a magical girl. It's just a cool nod to the readers, which also adds to the narrative surrounding Kyoko and the profound guilt she's going to be carrying moving forwards. The other angle we need to consider when looking at Papa Sakura is his perceived failure as a father. While it's true he's still immeasurably in the wrong, we need to acknowledge that as a father there's a lot of societal expectations thrust upon him to be able to provide for his family. Having a failing career and his household spiraling into poverty would have already put him on the edge in this regard, in my opinion. What kind of a father is he if he can't even provide enough for his family? It's this kind of thought that likely kept driving him. And this mindset, I think, is incredibly obvious. He suddenly happens upon a pocket of success when Kyoko's wish brings people to listen to his preaching, and his reaction isn't to start living a lavish life or overspend. He remains modest, humble, and thankful. The only change is more comfort in the form of food for his wife and children. But as I believe to be the lesson with Mami too, Papa Sakura's real shortcoming is an inability to admit to needing help. We get the sense that accepting charity or asking for it is something he never considered, whether out of fear, pressure to remain strong and capable, or something else we don't know. We can assume this because Kyoko is similar in regards to charity for the most part, and she already reflects a lot of her father's mannerisms and teachings. If he had just admitted to needing a bit of help feeding his family, or just stopped being so aggressive in his pursuit of spreading his message, perhaps Papa Sakura could have had more of a direct focus towards his family. In my opinion, the real tragedy of the Sakura family is not the result of Kyoko's wish. It has been an enormous buildup of tiny failures that began long before Kyoko ever contracted Kyubey. It begins and ends with her father. Had her father chosen a different path all those years ago, had he swallowed his pride, his fear, whatever it may be, he might have been able to keep his family out of poverty and prevented Kyoko's future wish entirely. In short, there is a lot more to the tragedy of the Sakuras than just the surface level reading of a father pushed to madness and a daughter surviving the onslaught. Continuing on, we leave the Sakura family for now and catch back up with Mami, who, as we can see immediately by her face, is not doing too well herself. Through her, we learn that Kyoko has not been over to Mutakihara in some time, and it is clearly causing Mami a great deal of worry, even if she is reassuring herself that her kohai and friend will be alright. In the opening of the chapter, Mami said to Kyoko that she never really bumped heads with other magical girls over her beliefs, but this part of the story actually seems to imply the opposite, as we see Mami reminisce about a couple of past encounters. In these, Mami emphatically attempts to convert the other magical girls to her cause, only to fail in two specific ways. The first of these is a very pointed rebuttal to what she's saying. A fellow magical girl essentially says that if the hunts for familiars becomes the norm and grief seeds become less common as a result, then Mommy would be directly to blame for more magical girls falling to despair. It's a savage argument to Mommy's proposal, but we can't really fault the other magical girl here either. Unfortunately, the system really does demand that it be this way. This is where my comparison between Mommy and Papa Sakura continues to be evident to me because it's essentially the same thing I brought up about the Sakura family's poverty. There, if Papa Sakura focused more on getting help to feed his family instead of putting most of his focus towards preaching, something that was never going to be appreciated, perhaps Kyoko's contract could have been avoided. Here, I think if Mommy considered a different approach, one where she would moderate her good deeds with the very real need for grief seeds instead of pushing an impossibly perfect standard into the world and expecting everything to work, perhaps her own tragedy could have also been avoided. The second rebuttal to her argument is less aggressive, but it honestly still hurts to read. It's one of those let them down gently refusals that never actually feel gentle. This is another point I believe we see get echoed in the future when we get to the original anime series. We see these encounters actually shake Mommy up quite a lot. I mean, she is shown crying after the latter of those examples, which is again another instance of her not being fully honest with Kyoko. I don't fault her for her dishonesty, it's obviously difficult to be open about weaknesses and insecurities. But there's no denying that if she had been honest about how badly these encounters affected her, maybe Kyoko too would have been more open about the reasons for her questions earlier in the chapter. Sayaka's tragedy is exacerbated by her need to be like Mommy, because Mommy was the ideal and could do no wrong in her eyes. If Sayaka had learned about Mommy's insecurities, perhaps her attitude about being a magical girl would have been different, and her eventual demise could have been avoided. As we continue, we get a shot of Mommy reacting to something after thinking about Kyoko again, but she brushes it off. It could just be that Mami was daydreaming and Kyubei's voice snapped her out of it, but I wonder if this is actually Mami registering Kyoko's spiking grief. Could it be that that very moment Mami reacts is when Papa Sakura's madness reaches its peak, and Kyoko witnesses everything firsthand? Kyoko and Mami are incredibly close at this point, so I wonder if maybe their ability to sense each other's feelings is too. I digress, it could just be an instance of me reading too much into it, but it was worth offering as an idea in my opinion. We return to Mami's apartment and we see that Kyoko's disappearance has been playing heavily on her. All her thoughts in this moment are solely focused on Kyoko's well-being, wishing she could come over to do anything that wasn't just fighting witches. I can't help but think of Homer's monologue in the concept movie trailer when I read through this, to be honest. In that trailer, Homer equates seemingly mundane things to the happiness of the goddess, being Madoka, stuff like the sunny days of May, good food, a family, but shortly after listing these things, the narration states that the goddess had none of these things. I know these aren't referencing each other in any way, but we can see some echoed narrative motifs here. Food, family, good weather, these are all things that become intrinsically linked to the idea of happiness. And much like the goddess had nothing that brought her happiness, we see the same with Mami here. The weather is cold. She wants to have a warm meal with Kyoko. She wants to do more than just fight. All of these things would bring her joy, and she believes it would also make Kyoko happy too. But neither Mami or Kyoko have any of those things. Even here, when she has the chance to actually confront her feelings, Mami instead forces herself to brush off the thoughts of Kyoko so she can continue to patrol the city. That brings us to presumably the following evening where Mami is out on one of these patrols. In the background, a large screen plays that night's news broadcast. Piece by piece, we learn that by this point in the story, Papa Sakura's murder-suicide plot has been enacted, as the bodies of himself, his wife, and Momo were discovered after a fire at their church was extinguished. We don't see the event here, mostly because we're meant to be in Mami's headspace in this moment, but also because we have no need to retread ground. We as fans will have already known how it looked, but the build-up throughout this chapter does more than enough to make the reveal still work effectively in my opinion. Following that, when we catch back up with Kyoko in Kazumino City, you may expect it to be a flashback to the night before, but instead we just see her in front of the ruined church dealing with the aftermath of everything. The scene actually begins with Kyubei approaching her to question why she isn't hunting for grief seeds, warning her that if she doesn't purify her soul gem, she will succumb to despair. I kind of find this interesting for Kyubei to urge Kyoko here. Now, Kyubei has obviously done this before, I think it does it several times for Sayaka in the original anime, but it's always with the knowledge or the idea that there's a better time for a magical girl's grief to be harvested. I find it really fascinating that Kyubei saw this moment of incomprehensible loss for Kyoko, the lowest moment in her life up to this point, and was still able to determine that now would not be the most efficient time for her to succumb. It's completely right, of course. Kyoko dying with Sayaka in the future is arguably better for the overall plan, but it really goes to show how meticulous and thorough the incubators truly are. Or it's just saying that to save face in the moment. Who knows? Kyoko's response to the question about witch hunting is dismissive. She simply says to Kyubei that she doesn't need her magic anymore. She curses herself for using a wish to try and solve her family's issues because, as far as she sees it now, her wish is the direct cause for their demise. Of course, we, the reader, can determine that's not entirely true, but still. Since her magic couldn't truly protect what she loved most, she considers it useless. There's a panel here I want to point out as particularly fantastic. Not necessarily technically impressive, although the art is as good as ever, but just the idea behind it. It's Kyubei in focus as Kyoko says her father's assessment of her was right, and that there exists no real difference between a magical girl and a witch. You kind of have to wonder if Kyubei thinks Kyoko has figured out the truth in this moment. After all, she has all the parts based on what she's saying. But luckily for Kyubei, she doesn't seem to be able to quite put two and two together. It's just a really clever panel. Hanokage did not waste a single space on any of these pages. And it just continues escalating as the next thing Kyoko talks about is, well, letting herself die. She asks Kyubey if she just completely stops purifying her soul gem, if she'll be able to die too, like the rest of her family. She says it's just a joke before Kyubey can say anything in response. I believe her when she says it's a joke here, not because Kyoko necessarily would joke about it per se, but because I think we can identify this as the moment where Kyoko breaks and becomes the character we know from the anime, the one whose personality would be able to deliver something so macabre only to brush it off seconds later, the one who would tell Sayaka to break her crush's arms and legs to make him fully dependent on her. While she probably is here, I don't think Kyoko remains suicidal. It's just that now, with most of her innocence ripped away from her, all she has to cope with her new reality is a dark sense of humor. But reality is far from humorous. Kyoko's next immediate witch hunt is not simply bad. Kyoko is struggling. Horribly. She's getting hurt, she can't fight the way she normally would, and worst of all, she can't even remember how to use magic. She's caught off guard by a brutal attack that pierces her body and makes her collapse, and it looks as though she's going to bleed out and die. She seems to pass out, and we finally see the different stories take on the final days of the Sakura household in the form of a dying memory. Now, a note that I want to put here is that, as far as I can tell, this memory is somewhat ambiguous. It could either be just the final days or a retelling of the whole story. Personally, I don't think they would retread or ground to retell the story about the church again in this book, so I'm going with the assumption that it is the final days. Just adding on here because I don't feel like going back in and editing this now, but no, this is actually a mix of the two. It's a build up to the final days of the Sakura family with bits and pieces of their history sprinkled in. That much is pretty obvious now that I'm reading this back. Crucially, this interpretation tells us just how slow the collapse actually was. We see the day the main church finally cut ties with Papa Sakura sometime after the initial fallout, as his preaching had apparently morphed into mad harassing rambling, and naturally with no support, the family's already sparse wealth instantly declined to the point where food was once again a luxury. In particular, we see a memory of Kyoko delivering an apple to her starving sister. When speaking to Momo, she delivers it with a happy demeanor and treats it like nothing. Even their mother thinks nothing of it, just assuming that it was charity. In truth, Kyoko actually had to fiercely protect herself to steal it. It instantly reframes that one scene in the original series where she tries sharing an apple with Sayaka, only for Sayaka to drop it on the ground in disgust when she realizes Kyoko stole it. The surface level reading of the scene is that Kyoko hates food being wasted because of her past with poverty, but the different story adds on an extra layer of hurt by showing us that her very last meal with her sister was cut up portions of an apple that she had to steal. As we continue further into Kyoko's memory, we get the sense that it might be a distorted mix of the past couple of days, as her mother in the memory appears to give her the apple back, saying that she and Momo don't need it. And accompanying that, we see her father returning from yet another failed outing, which prompts Momo and their mother to follow him as he encourages them to join him to go somewhere. I like this way of presenting the memory. It feels perfectly in line with the rest of this chapter's tension and building of suspense, but now entirely self-contained on the tragedy. It starts off innocent, which immediately is the trigger, because we know that the Sakura family is gone. The real mystery is how it happens. As it progresses, we see what going with father means in this context. Accentuated by imagery of shattered bottles, knives, and drops of blood, we end Kyoko's memory on that shot of Papa Sakura having taken his life and the obscured bodies of his wife and Momo. I have been arguing in favor of looking at the tragedy from Papa Sakura's perspective because I believe it adds a whole lot more nuance to the entire situation. Ultimately, I do think Papa Sakura is and should still be considered to be in the wrong. He committed an unforgivable and irreversible sin, and no matter what led to it, there was always a choice to do better. The way we navigate our personal burdens and tragedies matters just as much as the circumstances that caused them in the first place, and unfortunately, Papa Sakura is a man who could not set aside his pride and arrogance and let his madness control him in the end. We view him as a villain not because he took his life, but because of the pain that depression and anger caused to everyone else. Momo didn't get to grow up. The mother's efforts are basically ignored, and Kyoko lives with survivor's guilt and an unimaginable trauma. I appreciate that evil in Madoka Magica is very multifaceted and not a simple black or white situation. The specific memory of her family's end snaps Kyoko awake with a newfound power, complete and utter anger forcing her to focus on this witch. She defeats it with a spell that is familiar to anime viewers, her latticework barrier. So way back during the first chapter, we pointed out the difference in Kyoko's magic, and I wanted you guys to keep this question in mind. How come we don't see Rosso Phantasma in the main series? Well, that question gets answered as we continue. Kyubei says that Kyoko has forgotten how to use her magic because she rejected her own wish. Kyubei and the story do not seem to bring up latticework barrier here, which somewhat stands out as odd to me. Why, you might ask? As far as I can tell, throughout all of the different stories so far, this appears to be the first instance of latticework barrier being used, and I really think there's a lot to extrapolate from this. So Kyoko's wish resulted in her gaining the power to cast illusions, as the wish was a mass deception / illusion to make people come and listen to her father's sermons. Rejecting that wish, which she did earlier in this chapter, effectively is also rejecting the magic associated with it. This alone is already insane because there's so many implications about forcing oneself out of a contract that has potential to be further explored. But let's talk about the latticework barrier. The wording when Kyoko rejects her magic is very specific. She says specifically that her magic is no use to her since it can't protect what she holds dear. Shortly after rejecting her wish and losing her original magic power of illusions, she nearly dies to a witch, only to become reinvigorated and unleash a brand new spell defined by being a barrier. Inherently, a barrier can do two things. You can hide behind a barrier as a wall and block out things coming at you, or a barrier can be put between someone else and something harming them, in essence, turning that wall into a tool of protection. Obviously, there has been a rebirth for Kyoko in this moment. She loses her old magic and gains something new upon nearly facing death. On the surface, this seems to play further into the idea of Kyoko's perspective on things changing as she deals with the fallout of her father's actions, which definitely seems to be what we're initially meant to take away from this, I agree. But I actually believe there's an extra layer to this still. In Christianity, there is a term called born again, which refers to the spiritual rebirth of someone who has rejected sin and accepted God's light and salvation. But further than just rejecting sin, it's also about acknowledging that you have sinned in order to be forgiven. I can't for sure determine Hanokage's intent, but I read this chain of events for Kyoko's magic as a reference to the idea of somebody being born again. Kyoko's sin is the wish used to create an illusion or a lie. Inherently, it is deceitful, and we even get a reference to this idea within this same chapter. The first lie in the Bible is when Satan deceives Eve and tricks her into eating the forbidden fruit from the Garden of Eden. During Papa Sakura's breakdown, he says that Kyoko listened to the lies of a devil, being Kyubei, directly paralleling the story of the Garden of Eden and the original sin as seen in the Bible. We know that the story considers this deceptive magic a sin. Kyoko rejects this magic and her wish later in the chapter, saying that it can't defend who she loves. Reading between the lines, Kyoko is rejecting her sins and acknowledging its bad effects on her livelihood. When she comes back from the brink of death, her new magic awakens in the form of a defensive barrier that can be used for something much closer to what her true desire is: protection of her loved ones. In my opinion, Kyoko is someone who was spiritually born again. The problem in the immediate moment is that Kyoko doesn't quite see it that way, and it's entirely understandable given everything that has happened here. When Kyubei tells her that she has lost access to her magic, that's all she hears. Even after beating the witch, all she can do is lay on the ground as her soul gem becomes polluted with despair, muttering over and over how hopeless everything is. She sees no salvation from this point forward, and it is very likely she would have died here. But her one ally and friend, Mami, makes it just in time to heal her. She hugs the girl and apologizes for not being quicker while Kyoko sits in silence for a few seconds. But hearing Mami say, "Thank goodness that you're alive," is too much for her, and she snaps, sobbing into Mami's shoulder. All she can muster up in response through broken speech is that she let everyone die. The third chapter is absolutely impeccable in its ability to build suspense and mystery around an outcome that we already know the answer to. The mystique surrounding the downfall of the Sakura family is no longer whether or not it will happen. We're in a prequel story set before the events of Homer's time loop, so everything in the pages of these first chapters is set in stone. Mami and Kyoko will always have this history, and understanding what came before will help us both understand what came after in the original series and what will come here when the story inevitably diverges. But we still have one last chapter before the volume ends, so let's wrap up here and get to the final chapter of the first volume. We open in a domestic setting, a stark and almost jarring contrast to what we just left the last chapter on, as Mami has brought Kyoko back to her apartment. As usual, Mami is doing her normal routine of putting on a facade to keep the mood light for Kyoko. She's made her tea, given her a change of clothes, and is trying to present as cheerful as she can. It's a good intention, of course, but we can see by Kyoko's expressions and body language, her hands kept together, looking beyond Mami, etc., that this is not what Kyoko wants or needs. Kyoko almost just died to a witch after a mental break caused by her family's death. Sure, Mami doesn't know the entire context, but she knows Kyoko just lost her family. She's not necessarily in the wrong, but this forced positivity is the last thing that a grieving person needs. Mami invites Kyoko to stay with her until everything settles down in Kazumino City, trying to distance Kyoko from the tragedy and keep her busy so she doesn't begin to hyper-focus on it. This is pure speculation, but I wonder if Mami suggests this because she herself did the same thing. For a while, I've always believed Mami may be a foreign student, but that's mostly just a headcanon and not based on anything in particular. Still, I want to bring this up for consideration. Mommy imparts a lot of her own beliefs and mannerisms onto the other people she's around, and I can't help but feel that the same thing is happening here. Maybe not necessarily because she is a foreigner to Mitakihara City, but suddenly she must have put herself in this apartment far away from her parents' home to get as far from the source of her tragedy as possible. And of course, in her mind, since she feels it worked for her, she wants to get Kyoko to do the same. Kyoko refuses, naturally, as she already begun distancing herself ideologically from Mami earlier in the third chapter, and now in this chapter she begins the early signs of her physical distancing from Mami. Mami accepts her refusal but urges her to keep fighting with her like usual, telling her she will continue to support her in battle. And here we see the best example of something I brought up in the second chapter. Mami and Kyoko have very different priorities, and as we covered in the second chapter, early on it's about Mami wanting friendship versus Kyoko wanting tutelage. As time has passed, their personal lives have changed drastically, and so too have their wants and needs. At least, Kyoko's have. Kyoko underwent an unbelievable and radical change, the kind of change Mami went through much earlier in her career when she lost her family. You would think that because Kyoko's gone through a similar tragedy, Mami would be able to connect with her even easier, and Mami certainly believes that. The problem comes about in that initial mismatch of priorities. No matter what way you look at it, Mami and Kyoko never could have resolved things this soon because neither started off the relationship being entirely honest with one another. A house built on a shaky foundation may stand for a while, but the weight will eventually cause the foundation to crack and crumble until the house falls apart. And it's the same thing for a friendship. If there's no honesty or trust from the beginning, no matter how close you get, that initial lack of trust will cause cracks to appear in the future and sever that friendship. Mami even says something similar in the second chapter when she tries to describe her friendship with Kyoko to her classmates. She deliberately makes a point of mentioning how trust is important for their relationship to last. But as we naturally know, they never had that full honesty and trust in the very start, which led to them getting complacent about how they treat each other. And the best example is shown immediately in the next sequence. A few nights later, we see Mami and Kyoko catching up after a successful witch hunt, but things are far more somber than usual. Kyoko's injuries from the prior fight persist, even though magical girls are supposed to passively heal. As Mami heals her wounds for her, she points out that Kyoko is not maintaining her health at all, either physically or mentally. Mami's tone immediately shifts towards a strict mentor-like tone, which is precisely the exact opposite of what Kyoko wants or needs right now, ironically enough. She reprimands Kyoko for not fighting hard enough and letting herself get hurt. You see, Mami and Kyoko both self-harm in different ways. With Mami, she avoids her darker thoughts by distracting herself, and as we've gone over before, she tries to enforce this on Kyoko. If we take what Kyoko is doing as self-harm, which I think is fair as Sayaka's similarly reckless fighting in the original anime also reads as self-harm, having someone essentially tell her to try harder unintentionally reads as emotionally lacking. I want to segue here for just a moment. I was watching some reactions to the series. In particular, there was one, who I'll link below, from Danny Mota, who was reacting to the Rebellion story some time ago. I heard this person point out something I haven't seen others talk much about, and it's what inspired me to include this bit about self-harming. There's a beautiful scene in the Rebellion story where Homer Lily is being defeated so that the Law of Cycles can come and take Homera. In the scene in particular, the goddess's arms and hands have the residual marks of self-inflicted cuts. It's a scene I personally think about often because, as Danny pointed out, a lot of media might touch on depression and self-harm, but very rarely the aftermath of non-lethal self-harming. I also think it's interesting that Madoka is the one shown to hurt herself in this way. It brings up some questions about her as a person that might be worth further exploring in the future. The point is, when I bring up stuff that might seem like a reach, like saying Kyoko not healing is a reference to self-harm, I really don't think it is. Madoka Magica portrays mental health struggles in a lot of varying ways, whether abstract or direct. I'm not a medical professional, just someone who feels seen in the struggles that are portrayed. In any case, Mami asks point blank why Kyoko isn't using her enchantment magic, confused as to why she even got hurt in the first place. A buildup of anger and exhaustion finally pushes Kyoko to talk back, saying she doesn't need to rely on magic to beat witches. Of course, Mami doesn't know the truth about the loss of magic, which is just another instance of this misaligned foundation showing its cracks when Kyoko isn't fully honest about the situation. Mami tries to get a leg up in the talk, but Kyoko continues as she says that she had been looking for an opportunity to talk for a while. Kyoko very casually suggests that instead of fighting for familiars, they should only focus on witches. Her reasoning is the same as we see in the main series. It's about grief seed collection and maintaining energy. What I think is interesting here is that even though Kyoko clearly is suggesting something that Mami would never agree to, the former still words it in a way that would indicate Mami is included in those future plans. Regarding our battle plans, why don't we just focus on witches? It shows Kyoko doesn't really want to abandon Mami, so she leaves a subtle thread for her to follow so that they can still be friends. But as Kyoko herself admits, she also doesn't want to just keep playing along with Mami's views of justice and heroism. She jumps in before Mami can even try to change her mind, saying that it's impossible to do the things Mami wants, saving everyone and protecting the city. No matter how many times they save people from witches, if people want to die, they will find a way to do it. So the best thing to do in Kyoko's eyes is to just let them become food for familiars. In a twisted way, this still shows a bit of Kyoko's good-natured self. She specifically says that people who are already close to dying are the ones they should let become fodder. Obviously, that's still not good, don't get me wrong, but in Kyoko's defense, the fact that she says it about people like this reflects a desire to do good in some way. It's kind of like an extreme way of letting someone on life support be taken off it if they so choose to. It's not defensible in this case, but Kyoko is still trying to lessen the blow by making that distinction. Mami attempts to appeal to Kyoko, bringing up their now similar situations about their families, but Kyoko again doesn't let her get too many words in before she snaps. While you'd hope there would be some middle ground here, Kyoko argues that Mami can't possibly understand her because of the perceived differences in their circumstances. Mami was merely a witness to her parents' death, while Kyoko believes she is solely responsible for the loss of her family. The irony, of course, is not lost on me here. Mami has been believing the same thing for a long time, and yet in this moment she's being told to her face that she can't understand Kyoko's grief. Now, yes, they are different situations, but Mami truly can relate to her in this moment. Or at least, she could have if she had been more honest earlier in their relationship. Kyoko knows for sure that Mami feels like she has to prove she deserves her wish, but she's not aware of the crippling guilt that Mami feels for not doing more. Both are irrationally unfair to themselves. As we previously went over in the third chapter, Kyoko's family would have been on this downward trajectory with or without her wish. And of course, Mami's wish was not selfish, as she says, because she only had so much time to think before dying. But these are realizations that, even if they had been made here, would mean nothing now. Kyoko vows then and there to never use her magic again for anyone but herself, definitively placing herself opposite to Mami and her ideals. Mami's response is more or less a detached echo of what Kyoko's saying, asking if she's become disillusioned with her ways. I think this in particular is unfortunate for them because it may have been an instance where Mami could have said literally anything else in this moment. Sure, there is no guarantee that the outcome would have changed for the better, but it must hurt Kyoko that the response was immediately about whether or not her actions meant she'll leave Mami, rather than any semblance of trying to find a middle ground. And on the flip side, we must also consider that Mami must be fed up with trying to teach Kyoko what she believes is right and then getting basically nowhere. The reason I think this argument has to skew more in favor of Kyoko here is that Mami, as we've explored before, is a lot like Papa Sakura. Rigid to a fault, self-sacrificial, and armed with lofty dreams that can never possibly come true. Kyoko just saw the collapse of exactly that kind of mindset. She is not about to let herself go through it again. Kyoko tries to leave the area after her declaration, but Mami stops her by grabbing her wrist. Mami shares some incredibly important dialogue here that, although entirely unintentional on her end, reveals everything about her flaws. She essentially says to Kyoko that no matter how strong you act, it's just going to make you suffer more, and refuses to let her go off on her own. Let's zero in on that. Mami tells Kyoko not to act tough, which is exactly what she herself has always been doing. She is speaking the truth about her flaws for the first time ever, but it comes at the wrong time and in the wrong place. She's just using it to, in Kyoko's eyes, force her back into a specific mindset. In response to this, Kyoko transforms into her magical girl form and forces Mami off of her, promising to beat her just so she can leave. Once Mami sees that her former ally is very serious about fighting her, she is forced to transform herself just to defend from Kyoko's approach. What follows is an intense 7-page fight sequence between the senpai and her kohai. Fights with Mami in the franchise are always rather spectacular. I believe the professional term is that they fucking rule. The Rebellion stories Homura vs. Mami fight and Magia Records' Holy Mami fight are instant classics, and I have no doubt that if this were ever in animated form, Kyoko vs. Mami would have also been one of the most beloved fights in the franchise. Just the art alone here depicts an incredibly great deal about each other's mindsets in this moment. Kyoko is of course very aggressive now without her Rosa Phantasma. She performs leaping strikes to try and hit Mami head on, overextending even in a small space like the bridge that they're currently battling on. In turn, Mami's athleticism shines through masterfully as she dodges each of Kyoko's attacks because of how easy they are to spot. She retaliates by attempting to bind Kyoko, but after fighting with Mami for so long, Kyoko already knows her usual tactics and deflects her ribbons with ease. We also notice here that Mami's only actions in this fight so far have been in an effort to put as much distance between herself and Kyoko as she can. Even here, after Kyoko deflects the ribbons, we see that Mami was already running after using her magic. either because the goal was to keep Kyoko in place, or because she anticipated her breaking free. It calls back to the first fight of the book, where we see how Mami uses physical distance deliberately in her fighting style. In this fight, though, I think it's to make sure she has enough room to try and talk some sense into Kyoko. The issue, of course, is that their space is not in Mami's favor, and Kyoko's rushdown style means she can close the distance with relative ease. It forces Mami to have to bring out her muskets to block a spear thrust from Kyoko before knocking her back with the recoil of a gunshot. The knockback gives Mami enough room to unleash what at first seems to be Tiro Finale as she gears up an array of larger cannons behind her. She lets loose a barrage of shots, all aimed at Kyoko, who is momentarily caught off guard. That is, until she realizes that the attack was nothing more than a smokescreen. Kyoko remains still for a moment, watching as the rest of the shots only land nearby where she is standing. Not a single one hits her. Knowing that Mami is much better than that, Kyoko deduces that the fight is completely one-sided and that her opponent does not intend to harm her at all. Calling Mami soft, she criticizes her for not even trying, and doesn't bother to dodge any of Mami's other attacks as she launches herself into the air and throws herself into a downward spear thrust which ends up pointing straight at Mami's neck, just shy of actually hitting her. This panel is an incredible Easter egg which I imagine most readers caught, but the framing is the exact same as when Charlotte breaks from her doll form and approaches Mami. Mami's expression and pose are almost identical to when she was caught off guard by Charlotte's approach, and given that Kyoko was going to strike her neck, it's an obvious callback to this legendary scene. But I have something I want to bring up here. Myself and others have, over the years, debated why it is that Mami freezes up in the third episode when Charlotte attacks her. Sure, no human is infallible, she can't be expected to know everything. We also know that the prior scenes had her emotionally vulnerable as she exposed her deeper trauma to Madoka. But I'll be honest, none of these explanations quite sat right with me. But then we get to this story. I must reiterate a very crucial point. This volume and subsequently Farewell Story 2 must be considered as events that are set in stone and canon as they happen before Homer's time loop starts. Maybe there's some things that are different, but I fully believe we are meant to see this section of the timeline as canon, which means this fight between Mami and Kyoko is also canon. With this in mind, I think it's entirely fair to say that the reason Mami freezes when Charlotte approaches is because she is reminded of this exact fight. Luckily in this case, Kyoko obviously did not land the killing blow against Mami, only threatening to take her life if they crossed paths like this again. Defeated, Mami can't do anything, and as Kyoko leaves, she finally gets the chance to speak. She tells Kyoko that she ultimately hoped she would be different from the rest of the magical girls she had met before, as the only one who had shared her hopes and dreams. The final parting words she leaves her kohai with are a gut-wrenching and defeated, "You'll be able to deal with the loneliness." There's some interesting translation work at play here too. As far as I can understand, the original Japanese script appears to be more of a question. Mami seems to ask Kyoko directly if she can deal with the darkness/loneliness. Whichever way you read it, the fact that these are the parting words is still very effective in delivering its finality. With Kyoko now gone, Mami laments to herself about the outcomes as she transforms back to her civilian clothes. Her thoughts are locked onto the fact that she's back to being alone again. On the flip side, we see Kyoko in Kazumino City sometime later. She sits atop some construction site's foundation and overlooks the city holding her soul gem. In regards to Mami, she says something to the effect of, "Don't worry, someone like you will be able to make friends." This pair of panels perfectly encapsulates the mismatch of Kyoko and Mami I've been discussing throughout this video. Mami wants to rid herself of loneliness, but this desire prevents her from seeing Kyoko's deeper struggles. In turn, Kyoko's youth and inexperience at the start prevented her from recognizing Mami's needs earlier, and by the time she would have noticed this, it was already after her mental break. The different story does not shy away from showing us that these two were never meant to get off on the right foot. They were simply too blind to each other's needs. But life is unpredictable and chaotic. And in a world like Madoka Magica, where that already unpredictable world is subject to changes in the flow of time, that is even more important. The volume does not end there. Not yet. We continue, starting the epilogue of the volume inside Mami's apartment. We have no sense of the passage of time, so we're not exactly sure how long it's been since the last meeting between Kyoko and Mami. Our first peek back into Mami's life is a saddening one. A lone teacup sits on her table and it barely has anything taken from it, while Mami herself sits nearby, tears in her eyes and her head resting atop her arms. But she isn't actually alone. Someone is calling her name. The voice jolts her awake and she immediately recognizes it as Madoka's. Madoka says that there's been a big problem and that it involves Sayaka. This is another clever use of an ambiguous time flow. Anime watchers will probably see this and immediately think of the original show's third episode. Sayaka and Madoka split up when they spot Charlotte's labyrinth, and importantly, Madoka goes straight to get Mami because she doesn't have her cell number. For a single page, we have a lingering sense of dread hanging in the back of the mind, even if we might not fully register it because of our subconscious recognition of this setup. Of course, a closer look tells us this isn't quite the third episode because Kyubey is with Madoka, unlike in the original show where Kyubey actually stays with Sayaka. Continuing to the next page, we learn exactly where the timeline diverges here as we step away from Farewell Story's phenomenal groundwork and land squarely in Hanokage's original work. We are thrown right into a new version of the iconic Kyoko vs Sayaka alleyway fight from the 5th episode. That's right, in this story, Mami survives her encounter with Charlotte, and it seems that Sayaka making a wish sooner in the timeline is the reason why. Throughout the fight, Sayaka seems to have the upper hand, defending her stance on magical girl morality as Kyoko mocks her and her senpai she's so proud of. When Sayaka continues to defend Mami, though, Kyoko eventually gets annoyed enough to unleash a stronger assault, putting Sayaka in danger and threatening to beat her until her live for yourself message sticks with her. In that same moment, though, Mami finally makes her appearance along with Madoka, which forces Kyoko to disengage. Mami's language here is a far cry from how she has been through the prior chapters, but perfectly in line with who she is in the original series. She criticizes Kyoko immediately for trying to spread her beliefs to Sayaka, even going as far as admonishing her for leaving her territory. She aims a gun at Kyoko with a hardened expression. In return, Kyoko scoffs and says she expected to see Mami dead by now, and mockingly, the volume ends with Kyoko calling her Mami Senpai once more. What a volume. Seriously, and what a story too. Hanokage and Hiramatsu-san are incredible with their handling of these characters. This volume was again inspired by the original story by Hiramatsu-san, Farewell Story, and had a revised script written for it that was adapted by Hanokage. I know I have mentioned this already, but it bears repeating and making a point of the specific contributors to this incredible story. But of course, the different story is more than just its adaptation of an obscure drama CD. Part of why I want to explore this manga in depth is because of how lacking I think review content has been in terms of Madoka Magica's side stories here on YouTube. In my past and recent searches, I have found only 2 easy to locate reviews of the different story, and even among forums, the most you ever hear about is the first volume. Obviously, by the length of this script, it should be no surprise why the first volume is so fondly remembered. But what I want to do is use this review of it to get some spotlight on the rest of the story too. Personally, I don't know if I will actually continue this, but next time if I do, I hope to be diving into its second volume. Before we close out the video, it's time for some clarifications. As I was writing the script, I recently learned that Magia Exodra, the newest gacha game tie-in for the franchise, has an event dedicated to adapting Farewell Story. I don't know how the game works, my PC is not good enough to run it well, so I'm not sure if Exodra lets you replay events, so I will direct you to this YouTuber, Starlight Alchemist, who has archived the event for ease of viewing. Personally, I'm a little confused why they went with Farewell Story over the different story's first volume. Sure, a lot of the original drama CD story is the same, but the different stories additions make it the definitive version of that plot in my opinion. I mean, I can't complain, I've been asking for a new adaptation of the story for years, but I hope, really hope that they take the manga a bit more seriously going forward. In any case, I suppose it might be because the rest of the different story is a divergent timeline and so has no major relevance to the main plot of the series. Maybe one day we will see it get adapted in full after Walpurgis Night Rising, but who can say for sure. Until that time comes, please go ahead and support the original creators by purchasing a copy of this extraordinary story if you don't already own it. I'm obviously not sponsored in any way, I just want this story to finally get more eyes on it. Anyway, thanks for watching this video and thanks for watching it all the way through. I will see you all in the next video whenever that might be.